The first presentation is by Jonathan Kaplan, who is honorary adjunct fellow in the Imagining Fashion Futures Lab at the University of Technology, Sydney in Australia, where he completed his doctorate in 2019. Jonathan's talk is titled Jews and Trachtenmoden, Rural Dress and Self-Fashioning in Austria during the fin-de-siècle and interwar periods. So please, Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Svenja, and thank you, Svenja and Gil, for putting together such a great workshop series that I'm really excited to take part in. Tell me to speak up at any point if I'm speaking too softly. I tend to have a low voice. Before I begin, I will add that most of the examples this evening are more from the interwar period, just for time, to stick to the time limit. Okay. A number of years ago, when I was conducting research for my doctorate on the dress patterns of Jewish men in Vienna, my research brought me to the Central Archives for the History of the Jewish People in Jerusalem, where the archivist showed me an album of photos believed to have belonged to a Viennese Jewish family or one possibly from Moravia. The names of the individuals depicted and the dates of many of these photographs are lost. What survives is evidence of how Austrian Jewry dressed during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, a sartorial distinction noticeable for different occasions and contexts. There are two particular images that you can see now, taken at the same atelier, that depict a family of 3 women, 3 men, and 2 young boys. In the photographs, these family members are dressed in somewhat folkish or folksy attire. The women in dirndl-style skirts and aprons, the young boys wearing lederhosen, and although the men are wearing tailored jackets that don't quite, that are not the traditional Trachtenjanker common among folk costumes, they are wearing breeches and long socks and boots. They give an impression of embarking on a Wanderung, or a hike. Such dress patterns were not unusual. As I pursued my research into the sartorial habits and practices of Viennese Jews during the late 19th and early 20th centuries, I came across many similar images. Amongst the portraits of men and women in stiff suits and fashionable frocks, or children in sailor costumes, are more casual and light-hearted images appearing to have been taken in studios like this or in rural environs. Subjects are dressed in styles that bring to mind images of the provincial ideal. The donning of these typically German garments might be taken as evidence of their wearer's dedication to Deutschtum or German Kultur, and an individual's advanced assimilation, and in some ways they are. Writing of the meaning of folk costumes toward the end of the 1920s, the Swiss journalist and novelist Rudolf von Tafel argued its importance lay in signifying the wearer's membership to a particular class or Volksstamm, an ethnic group or tribe. However, beyond its symbolic meanings, the typical use in ceremonial contexts, folk-style dress in much of Central Europe had long been adopted as a form of leisure attire. By the interwar period, Volkstrachten, or in their generic and popularized form of Trachtenmoden, fashionable dress based on folk costume, were adopted by urban visitors to rural resorts and spa towns in the southern German environs. Jewish visitors in such towns adopted these styles for multiple purposes: a conscious statement of acculturation and dedication to the dominant culture in which they lived, an attempt to pass as Gentile, or perhaps simply as a way of following conventional sartorial fashions. Nevertheless, the multi-layered symbolic meanings of such styles are pertinent when considering the dress habits of Austrian Jewry, particularly in light of antisemitism during the fin-de-siècle and interwar periods, and the later Nazi-era Trachtenverbot, whereby Jews were forbidden from wearing German Trachten. This paper examines a number of photographs of Viennese Jews, alongside other visual and written evidence, and considers the significant and nuanced meanings of Trachten for Viennese Jews and self-fashioning before the 1938 Anschluss. Photography serves as a useful means for examining prevalent dress fashions within society. Unlike fashion plates, advertisements, and periodicals, or fashion journalism, supposed projections or desired fashions on the part of industry personnel and journalists, photography offers a glimpse into the reality of dress practices across class, religious, or ethnic boundaries. Numerous scholars have written about the photograph's truthful nature, which John Sharkovsky asserts is the very act of recording reality. However, the challenge with using photography as a lens through which the context of a subject can be understood is that most photography, especially portrait photography, is posed. Not only does the individual, in awareness of the photographer's lens, adjust their pose, but similarly present an ideal version of the self. In this manner, scholars have addressed the tendency of individuals to dress up before the camera's lens, a form of sartorial masquerade, whereby the individual being photographed presents his or her ideal self to the world. In the context of this research and the theme of this workshop series, this idea is directly linked to notions of Jewish acculturation and self-fashioning. Over the course of the 19th century, the styles of clothing worn by rural populations in the southern German lands, so inclusive of what is today Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, slowly came to influence popular sartorial fashions. Originally, the term Tracht simply denoted clothing worn by rural populations or any population on a regular basis, and not necessarily one that was used or reserved for special occasions. The development of Trachtenmoden, like the original styles that inspired them, was connected with Austria's rural environs and the provincial ideal. Due to the historical development of Austria's Jewish population in its German crown lands, and not taking into account the far larger communities in the Czech lands and Galicia, by the First World War, Austrian Jewry was predominantly concentrated in Vienna, or Austro-German Jewry was predominantly concentrated in Vienna, and was home to Europe's third largest Jewish city, in contrast to the largely non-Jewish Austro-German crown lands. Many Jews during the latter Habsburg and interwar periods also perceived the provinces as somehow non-Jewish, and they dealt with this in numerous ways. To some, the provincial non-Jewishness was attractive, and families or individuals wishing to assimilate into the dominant Austro-German society, or at least express their dedication to German culture and nationality, purchased or rented homes and other summer accommodation in areas without established Jewish communities. While holidaying in the Salzkammergut, for example, Viennese Jews adopted the sartorial modes associated with the provinces and the rural populations they found themselves living amongst. Viennese and other Austrian Jews adopted Volkstrachten and Trachtenmoden for various reasons. The choice to don such styles of garments, for some was a way to signal their dedication to Deutschtum, whereas for others, simply a matter of keeping up with the latest fashions. For example, in her unpublished memoir, Lilian Bader remembered the excitement she felt as a child when she was permitted, and I quote, to change from my eternal dresses in sailor style into a dirndl while spending summer holidays in the Salzkammergut. Of course, there were exceptions to Tracht being reserved for wear on holiday in rural environs. The Viennese-born philosopher Karl Rudolf Fischer recalled adopting Tracht for everyday attire as a young boy in 1930s Vienna, considering it smart, fashionable, and youthful in the original German fesch, modisch, und jugendlich. For the most part, however, Tracht was reserved as a form of what we might refer to today as resort wear, and we can see some examples from various 1930s fashion magazines that were published in Vienna. Photographs depicting individuals dressed in authentic Trachten or Trachtenmoden are widespread. Such styles were adopted by individuals and families with varying political and cultural sentiments, cultural and religious sentiments, I should add. For example, this photograph of Greta and Fritz Stern, taken in 1937. Both came from traditional families. In Fritz's case, a slightly more orthodox one. His orphaned at a young age, his aunts made him later fill in every day after reaching the age of bar mitzvah. However, as adults, both would reject religion in favor of socialism and Austrian patriotism. Fritz, in fact, went as far as to remove himself or distance himself from the community by declaring himself konfessionslos, without a religious confession, in 1923. In this photograph, we can see Greta and Fritz dressed in styles that publicized their dedication to Austrian patriotism. Despite their rural appearance, however, this dress is not authentic Volkstrachten and rather a version of Trachtenmoden that would have outed them as rural visitors to the country. Urban visitors to the country. Whether individual Jews donned Trachtenmoden for purposes of being fashionable or in this case for more deep-seated reasons connected to a desire to assimilate and identify wholeheartedly with the symbolic meanings of Volkstrachten and Deutschtum, the difference was of little importance to anti-Semites, who felt that Jews were appropriating a culture and its material elements that didn't belong to them. Photographs of the renowned Viennese-born Jewish writer Stefan Zweig, particularly from the period in which he lived in Salzburg, depict him wearing a relaxed form of attire. In this example, we can see under his tweed jacket, which is not a Trachtenjanke or an English tweed, but he appears to be wearing a lederhosen and possibly Wadenstutzen or long socks. They both had folkish connotations. In his biography of Zweig, Oliver Matuszek explains that the author's adoption of this variation of folkish attire followed that of others attempting to keep abreast of sartorial fashions. When considered in light of Zweig's public writing and private letters on the question of national identity, Matuszek's assertion of Zweig's rejection of nationalistic attitudes, as well as his adoption of more folkish attire simply as a form of following fashion, seems to ring true. However, Zweig's adopted provincial sartorial identity was not widely or warmly accepted by everyone, and to quote Matuszek, attracted the unflattering sobriquet of Salon-Tiroler in some quarters, roughly Alpine tourist. Such attitudes regarding Jews and the misuse of Volkstrachten were common tropes in wider cultural and social discourse, were directly linked to the perceived binary of the cosmopolitan, depraved Jewish metropolis, and on the other hand, its simple, traditional, and racially pure counterpart of the land. Satirical magazines, for example, employed this trope in visual form through caricatures that often depicted ugly, deformed figures with stereotypically Jewish features, such as curly dark hair, hook noses, and protruding lips, looking ridiculous in Volkstrachten, as we can see here from the widespread and popular Viennese weekly magazine Kikeriki. However, it wasn't simply a matter of laughing at Jewish inability to fit in, supposed Jewish inability to fit in. Such caricatures contained a deeper reference to the accusation that Jews were attempting to mask their true identities with clothing and trick the Gentile body politic into thinking they were one of us. The symbolism of Volkstrachten and reactions to those who wore them took on a more exclusionary tone after the 1938 Nazi annexation of Austria, the so-called Anschluss. Among the discriminatory restrictions placed on Austria's Jewish population was the Trachtenverbot of June 1938, beginning in Salzburg but spreading to other parts of the country, whereby Jews and those deemed Jewish by authorities were forbidden from dressing in Trachten with the threat of fines and imprisonment. As University of Salzburg professor Hans Haas has commented, Tracht was no longer a beautiful form of clothing, but rather a Sache des Volkstums, and Jews no longer belonged. Despite earlier critique and ridicule and later prohibition, many Viennese Jews continued to dress in popular Trachtenmoden when holidaying in rural locations. For some who would flee to the safety of other countries after the Anschluss, Trachtenmoden, along with other aspects of their Austrian culture, would travel with them. During the course of my research into the dress patterns of Viennese Jews prior to the Second World War, I interviewed a number of refugees and survivors, some of whom commented on their childhood dirndl costumes or lederhosen that they still had in their possession, or else, if they no longer had them, had at least brought them to Australia. Such as this dirndl worn by Greta Stern, we've already seen in a photograph, until recently in the possession of her daughter Eva Engel of Sydney, and now in the collection of the Sydney Jewish Museum. And we can also see in this photograph on the right, Eva in 1940 as a refugee child in New Zealand, with whom she believes, or we can't remember, another refugee child, both dressed up as typical Austrians. Walking the streets of Salzburg, St. Gilgen, Bad Aussee, and other towns, countless towns and villages in Austria today, one can admire, and perhaps for those brave enough, purchase a form of Trachten from the many boutiques specializing in traditional Austrian costume. Although I would argue that these examples that we're seeing are not traditional, these are Trachtenmoden rather than authentic Volkstrachten. Judging from the spread of such boutiques and their online presence, it seems that Trachtenmoden are still very much in demand. But what of Jews in this style of dress in Austria today? In the 2013-14 winter issue of the American Jewish feminist journal Lille, Austrian-based journalist Karen Engel penned an article about the complicated relationship between Jews and Trachten, including that of her own daughter, under the title, "Should a Jewish Girl Wear a Dirndl?" However, a detailed study of the relationship between Austrian Jews and Volkstrachten, or in their popularized form of Trachtenmoden, both prior to 1938 and since 1945, is still lacking. Given the politicization of these styles during the Nazi era, as well as the differing demographics of Austrian Jewry pre- and post-World War II, it would not be surprising if we were to discover a complicated story. Nevertheless, for many Jews of pre-1938 Vienna, garments inspired by folk costumes, with their varied and often conflicting meanings, were part of their cultural heritage and consumption. To many, the adoption of popular forms of dress did not necessarily signify a rejection of Jewishness, but rather that they too, like others, were members of Austrian culture, a way to assert their presence within a wider, often hostile society, as Jews, Austrians, or simply followers of fashion. Like other forms of fashionable dress, with its multitude of symbolic registers, promised wearers the possibility of respectability, equality, and/or invisibility, Volkstrachten and Trachtenmoden were highly coded forms of dress that created a particular appearance and at times resulted in negative repercussions for its wearers. Thank you.